The scent of wilting roses hung heavy in the small room, a sweet funereal perfume that clung to the back of Alara's throat. It was her wedding day. The thought felt like a stone in her stomach. Outside, the September sky wept a slow, gray drizzle, the drops streaking down the old farmhouse window like tears, mirroring the one she refused to let fall. She stared at her reflection in the warped glass of the antique vanity, a stranger in an ivory dress that felt more like a shroud. The dress, a simple second-hand slip of silk, had been her mother's only concession to tradition. Everything else about this day was a transaction, a cold, hard line of figures on a balance sheet. At 20 years old, Alara was not marrying for love, or for a future filled with whispered promises and shared dreams. She was marrying to save the dirt beneath her feet, the splintered wood of the barn, the rows of sleeping flowerbeds that held the sum of her father's life and the entirety of her own heart. She was marrying Mr. Alistair Blackwood, a man older than her own late father, a man whose name was a shadow that fell over their entire valley. He was wealth and power and their last desperate hope. Her mother entered the room without knocking, her presence sucking the last of the warmth from the air. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice clipped. There was no softness in it, no maternal comfort. There rarely was. Her mother was a woman forged in the fires of perceived hardship, her face a permanent mask of grim resolve. "He's here," she added, straightening a fold in Alara's dress with a rough tug. "The car is waiting. Don't keep him waiting." Alara looked at her mother's reflection. The years of struggle had etched hard lines around her eyes and mouth. For a fleeting moment, Alara tried to see the woman her father had loved, the one in the faded photographs who smiled with her whole face. But that woman was long gone, replaced by this brittle stranger who saw her daughter not as a child to be cherished, but as an asset to be leveraged. "Mama," Alara whispered, the word tasting like ash. "Please. There has to be another way." "There is no other way," her mother snapped, her eyes flashing with a familiar, weary anger. "Do you want to see a foreclosure notice nailed to our door? Do you want to watch them auction off every last petal your father cultivated? Alistair Blackwood is offering us a lifeline. All it costs is you." The words were cruel, but they were the same ones her mother had been repeating for weeks, a litany of guilt and obligation. The farm was failing. A series of bad harvests, a drought, and a mountain of debt had brought them to their knees. Mr. Blackwood, who owned most of the land in the county, had made an offer. He would absorb their debt, and the farm would be safe. In exchange, Alara would become his wife. It was a feudal arrangement, a relic from another century, but in their desperation, it had become their only reality. Alara thought of her father, of his calloused hands turning the soil, of the way he'd named a strain of pale yellow roses after her. The Alara Dawn, he'd called them. He had been a kind, gentle man whose love for the farm was only surpassed by his love for his family. What would he think of this? The thought was a fresh stab of pain. Her mother, however, seemed to believe it was what he would have wanted. He would do anything to save this land, she'd said. And so, Alara had to. The drive to the courthouse was a blur of rain-slicked roads and oppressive silence. Mr. Blackwood sat in the front of the town car, a stoic silhouette against the gray landscape. He hadn't spoken a single word to her since he'd arrived, offering only a stiff, formal nod. He was exactly as the rumors described. Tall, imposing, with a face carved from granite and eyes that held the chilling emptiness of a winter sky. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the light around him, making him appear even more remote and formidable. Alara sat in the back with her mother, feeling small and breakable, a ghost at her own wedding. The ceremony was as cold and impersonal as she had feared. A bored justice of the peace recited the vows in a monotone voice in a wood-paneled room that smelled of dust and stale coffee. When it was her turn to speak, Alara's voice was a thread of sound. "I do." The words felt like a betrayal of every dream she had ever held. Alistair's voice when he spoke was a low, gravelly rumble that offered no comfort. He slid a simple, heavy gold band onto her finger. Felt like a manacle. He did not smile. He did not look at her with anything resembling affection. He simply fulfilled his part of the contract. And just like that, she was Mrs. Blackwood. The ride to his estate was even quieter than before. Her mother had stayed behind, her duty done. Now Alara was truly alone with this stranger. This man who owned her future. The Blackwood estate was miles out of town. A sprawling expanse of land hidden behind a high wrought iron gate that swung open as they approached. A long winding driveway snaked through a forest of ancient, skeletal trees, finally revealing the house. It wasn't a house, it was a monolith. A Gothic mansion of dark stone and pointed gables that clawed at the sky. It was magnificent, but in a way that was meant to intimidate, not welcome. It looked like a place where secrets went to die. A stern-faced housekeeper greeted them at the door and led Alara up a grand, sweeping staircase, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. The air inside was still and cold, heavy with the scent of beeswax and thyme. Portraits of grim-faced ancestors watched her from the walls, their painted eyes following her with silent judgment. "This will be your room, madam," the housekeeper said, opening a heavy oak door. The room was larger than the entire ground floor of her farmhouse. A four-poster bed draped in dark velvet dominated the space. A marble fireplace stood cold and empty against one wall. French doors led to a stone balcony overlooking a vast, manicured garden. The garden was technically perfect. Every hedge sculpted, every path pristine, but it was devoid of color, of life. It was a garden of greens and grays, as joyless as its owner. "Mr. Blackwood's chambers are in the west wing," the housekeeper added, a subtle but clear statement. They would not be sharing a room. Relief warred with a strange sense of insult. She was a wife in name only, a business arrangement to be housed and maintained. The housekeeper curtsied and left, closing the door with a soft, final click. Alara was alone. She walked over to the French doors and stepped out onto the balcony. The rain had softened to a mist, shrouding the grounds in a ghostly veil. This was her new home, her gilded cage. She wrapped her arms around herself, the silk of the dress feeling cold against her skin. She thought of her little room back at the farm, with its faded floral wallpaper, and the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine that drifted in through the open window. She had traded all of that for this silent, opulent prison. A single tear finally escaped, tracing a cold path down her cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. Hours passed. The sky outside bled from gray to a deep, bruised purple, and then to black. No one came. A silent maid had brought a dinner tray earlier, but Alara hadn't touched it. The knot of despair in her stomach had stolen her appetite. She had changed out of the wedding dress and into a simple cotton nightgown, feeling like a child playing dress-up in a house far too big for her. She was sitting in a velvet armchair by the cold fireplace when a sharp knock echoed through the room. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was him. The door opened and Mr. Alistair Blackwood stepped inside. He was just as imposing in the dim lamplight as he had been in the harsh light of day. His expression was unreadable, a mask of cold indifference. He closed the door behind him, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at her. Her mind raced. What did he want? Was this it? Was he coming to claim his husbandly rights? The thought sent a tremor of pure fear through her. She shrank back in the chair, her hands gripping the armrests, her knuckles white. This was the part of the bargain she hadn't let herself think about, the terrifying, unspoken clause in their contract. But he paid her no mind. His gaze was fixed on the grand fireplace, his brow furrowed in concentration. He walked slowly, deliberately towards it, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rug. Alara held her breath, watching his every move, her fear morphing into a profound and unsettling confusion. He stopped before the hearth, his back to her. For a long moment he just stood there, a dark statue in the heart of her new prison. Then, he did something she would never have expected in a million years. With a soft groan of aging joints, the powerful, intimidating Mr. Blackwood sank to his knees. He wasn't kneeling to her. He was kneeling before the fireplace. Alara watched, mesmerized and terrified, as his old, surprisingly steady hands reached for the hearth. He bypassed the ornate iron tools and the stack of perfectly cut logs. His fingers sought out the edge of a specific stone, a piece of dark, veined marble at the very bottom. His hands, which she had imagined as cruel and unyielding, began to tremble with a strange, desperate urgency. He worked his fingertips into the slim crack around the stone, prying, his breath coming in soft, ragged rasps. A low scraping sound broke the silence as the stone finally gave way, revealing a dark, hollow space within the foundation of the fireplace. He was revealing a secret, and in that moment Alara knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this secret was the real reason she was here, and it was infinitely more complex and terrifying than a simple farmhouse debt. The loose hearthstone clattered softly against the ancient marble as Alistair carefully set it aside. Alara remained frozen in the armchair, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now laced with an unbearable curiosity. What could possibly be hidden within the cold, dark maw of that fireplace? Her gaze darted between the shadowy recess and Alistair's stoic, unreadable face. He finally retrieved a small, unassuming wooden box, dust-covered and worn smooth in places, the kind that might hold trinkets or forgotten letters. It looked utterly out of place in the opulent, immaculate room. He stood slowly, the effort clearly visible in the slight tremor of his movements. The box was cradled in his hands as if it were something infinitely precious. He didn't immediately open it. Instead, he finally turned to Alara, and in the dim light of the bedside lamp she saw it. The granite mask of his face cracked. The cold, empty winter sky in his eyes had been replaced by a profound, weary sadness, a sorrow so deep it seemed to age him by another decade. "Alara," he said, his voice no longer the harsh gravel she'd heard at the courthouse, but soft, almost fragile. The sound of her name on his lips, spoken with such unexpected gentleness, was more disarming than any threat. This marriage is a sham." The words hung in the air, echoing the very thoughts that had plagued her, yet hearing them from him was a shock. He crossed the room slowly, deliberately, and settled into the armchair opposite hers, placing the wooden box on the small table between them. He gestured towards it. "This box contains the truth your mother has hidden for 20 years. His eyes, now filled with an almost unbearable pain, fixed on hers. "And a promise I made to your father." A promise to her father? The words made no sense. Her father had been a simple farmer, a man of the earth. What promise could he have made to this powerful, enigmatic figure? Her confusion was a swirling vortex, consuming the last vestiges of her initial terror. She wanted to ask, to demand answers, but her throat felt dry and tight. Alistair reached for the wooden box and with a slow, deliberate movement, unlatched the tarnished brass clasp. The lid lifted with a soft sigh of ancient wood. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were 2 bundles of letters, tied with brittle, discolored ribbons. The faint, sweet scent of dried lavender and old paper drifted from the box. He picked up the first bundle, his fingers tracing the delicate cursive on the topmost envelope. "These," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "are letters between your father, Thomas, and my late wife, Lillian." Alara's mind reeled. Her father, and Alistair Blackwood's wife? The sheer impossibility of the connection left her speechless. She knew of Lillian Blackwood, of course, the legendary beauty who had died young, the reason the Blackwood estate was rumored to be so melancholy. But her father? A simple farmer? It was absurd. "They were soulmates," Alistair continued, his gaze distant, lost in a past only he could see. Before either of them was married, before societal expectations and family pressures and circumstance tore them apart. He opened one of the letters from the bundle, his thumb caressing the faded ink. They wrote to each other for years in secret, long after they had both married others. Not as lovers, not in the physical sense, but as confidants, as two halves of a whole, speaking across the chasm of their separate lives. Alara felt a cold dread creep through her veins. Her parents' marriage had not been one of grand passion, but it had always seemed solid, built on a quiet understanding. The thought of her father, the man who had taught her to love the earth, harboring such a deep, secret affection for another woman, was a profound betrayal, not just of her mother, but of her own idealized memories. Alistair seemed to read the turmoil in her eyes. "It was not what you think," he said, his voice softening further. "After they were separated, Lillian was forced into a marriage with me. I was a young, ambitious man, eager to expand my family's influence. She was beautiful, well-connected. It was an arranged marriage, common for our station. Thomas, your father, married your mother around the same time." He sighed, a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "Lillian was a gentle soul. She never loved me as she loved Thomas, and I was too proud, too consumed with my own ambitions to truly see her. But I loved her in my own way. And I saw her unhappiness. I knew of their enduring friendship, their letters. I allowed it. I knew that if she could not have Thomas in body, she deserved him in spirit." The confession hung in the air, a devastating revelation. Alistair Blackwood, the cold, unfeeling monolith, had knowingly allowed his wife to communicate in secret with another man. He had carried that quiet sorrow, that profound understanding, for all these years. Her perception of him, the villain she had imagined, was dissolving into something far more complex, a man of quiet integrity and devastating loneliness. His sacrifice, his pain suddenly felt palpable. Alara's mind spun, trying to reconcile the image of her father, the gentle giant, with this passionate, secret lover. And her mother, what had she known? Had she been living a lie for all these years, or was she simply unaware of her husband's enduring devotion to another? The foundation of her family, the very bedrock of her existence, was cracking beneath the weight of these revelations. Alistair closed the first bundle of letters and picked up the second. This one was smaller, containing only a few thicker envelopes. His hands, which had trembled earlier, were now steady, almost reverent. "Lillian and Thomas's story took a turn," he said, his voice laced with a bittersweet ache. "A brief moment, when both their spouses were away. A desperate, fleeting reunion. A culmination of years of suppressed emotion." He paused, and his eyes, so full of sorrow, met Alara's directly. "A secret that changed everything." He reached for the final letter in the second bundle. It was thicker than the others, folded meticulously. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, and the ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably her father's, the familiar, strong, looping script that had filled her childhood storybooks. "This," Alistair said, his voice now thick with emotion, "was written by your father to Lillian on his deathbed." He passed the letter to Alara. Her hands trembled as she took it, the aged paper feeling feather-light yet impossibly heavy. The intimacy of holding her father's last words to his true love was almost unbearable. Her eyes scanned the opening lines, a wave of profound grief washing over her for the man she had loved so dearly, a man whose heart she now realized she had never truly known. "My dearest Lillian, if you are reading this, then I am gone. The doctors say it won't be long now. My only regret is leaving this world without telling you the truth, or ensuring our greatest secret is protected. Our Alara. She is a wonder, a reflection of your beauty and spirit. I have loved her with every fiber of my being, and your heart beats within hers. My wife, bless her, has raised her as her own, believing the story we concocted to save us both from scandal. But now as I face the end, I worry. My wife, in her bitterness, may not protect our daughter as she deserves. Alara's breath hitched in her throat. The words blurred before her eyes, but one name stood out, stark and undeniable. Alara. Our Alara. A cold, sickening realization began to dawn on her, slowly, painfully. She looked up at Alistair, her eyes wide with a dawning horror and disbelief. He nodded, his gaze unwavering, confirming the unimaginable truth even before she had fully processed it. You are not her mother's child, Alara, Alistair said, his voice heavy with revelation. You are the biological daughter of Thomas and Lillian. You are my late wife's child. Her greatest secret, given to your father's wife to raise in secret to avoid a devastating scandal. My wife died shortly after your father, and his dying wish was for me to protect our daughter. To protect you. The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Her entire life, every memory, every connection, every truth she thought she knew, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The world tilted on its axis. The woman who had raised her, who had been her mama, was not her mother. The man who had just revealed this devastating secret, the stoic age-old Groom, was now her only link to a past she never knew and a future that felt terrifyingly uncertain. The world swam before Alara's eyes, the opulent room dissolving into a blur of velvet and shadows. The letter slipped from her numb fingers and fluttered to the floor. She was a ghost, a secret, a lie wrapped in 20 years of borrowed life. The woman she had called mother, whose coldness had always felt like a personal failing on Alara's part, was not her mother at all. She was her keeper, her jailer. The man sitting opposite her, Alistair Blackwood, was not her husband, but a guardian she never knew she had. The floor seemed to fall away, leaving her suspended in a terrifying, weightless void of non-existence. Alistair watched her, his expression a mixture of profound pity and patient resolve. He did not rush her, allowing the full, crushing weight of the revelation to settle. He had carried this truth for years, and he understood that it was a burden that could break a person. How? Alara finally managed to whisper, the word a ragged, desperate plea. How is this possible? Lillian discovered she was with child shortly after her last meeting with your father, Alistair explained, his voice a steady, grounding presence in her swirling chaos. She was terrified. A scandal would have destroyed both our families, but more than that, it would have destroyed Thomas. He was a good man, an honorable man, and the shame would have been his ruin. So they made a plan. Your mother, the woman who raised you, had recently suffered a miscarriage. They were devastated, desperate for a child. It was a cruel twist of fate, but it presented a desperate, hidden opportunity. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze earnest. Thomas told his wife that Lillian, an old friend, was pregnant and trapped in a terrible situation, and that the child would be given up. He convinced her to fake the remainder of her pregnancy, so they could raise the baby as their own, saving it from an orphanage. It was a story built on a foundation of half-truths, but she believed it. She agreed to raise you. Lillian gave birth in secret, and you were given to them. The story was so elaborate, so audacious, it felt like something from a Gothic novel, not the quiet, simple life she had always known. The farm, her childhood, the scent of roses and damp earth. It was all a stage, a carefully constructed set for a play in which she was the unwitting star. And the debt? She asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. The farm? This marriage? A fiction, Alistair confirmed, his voice firm. Your father on his deathbed was terrified for you. He knew his wife's heart had hardened over the years. He suspected she resented you, resented being a living reminder of the love he held for another. His greatest fear was that she would cast you out or worse, use you. He wrote to me a final plea, begging me to fulfill Lillian's dying wish, to protect you no matter the cost. Alistair's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I owed them both that much. After Lillian passed, I honored my promise. I watched over you from a distance, ensuring you were safe. He gestured around the grand room. When I saw the farm begin to struggle, I saw an opportunity. I manufactured the crisis. The debt was an elaborate fabrication, a construct of lawyers and accountants, designed to create a situation so severe, so hopeless that your guardian would be forced to consider my proposal. The marriage was the only legal mechanism I could devise to bring you under my care, to get you away from her, without revealing the truth and causing a scandal that would tarnish your parents' memory. It was a staggering, complex deception, a game of chess played over 2 decades with her life as the prize. She was not a sacrifice to save her family, she was a treasure being rescued. The knowledge was both terrifying and liberating. A fire began to smolder in the pit of her stomach, a white-hot anger that burned through the shock and grief. The years of feeling inadequate, of craving a warmth that was never offered, of believing she was a burden, it was all a lie. She had been a tool, a pawn in a bitter woman's long silent game of resentment. I have to see her, Elara said, her voice now sharp, clear, and edged with steel. I have to confront her. Alistair simply nodded. I will take you. The drive back to the farm was the inverse of the journey that morning. The sky had cleared and a pale watery sun was attempting to break through the clouds. The world outside seemed sharper, more defined, as if a veil had been lifted from her own eyes. Alistair drove in a comfortable silence, a protective presence beside her. She was no longer a frightened girl being delivered to her fate. She was a woman on her way to reclaim her truth. When they pulled up to the familiar, weathered farmhouse, it looked smaller, shabbier than she remembered. The woman who had raised her was on the porch, pruning a rosebush. She looked up as the car approached, a flicker of surprise followed by a scowl. What are you doing back here? She demanded as Elara and Alistair got out of the car. Did he tire of you already? Elara walked straight up to her, her steps sure and steady. The anger had cooled into a calm, chilling resolve. She looked into the hard, familiar eyes and felt nothing. No love, no fear, only a vast, empty space where a daughter's affection should have been. Why didn't you ever love me? Elara asked, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a lifetime of pain. The woman flinched, her hand tightening on the pruning shears. I raised you. I fed you. I clothed you. What more did you want? I know everything, Elara said, her voice cutting through the woman's defenses. I know about Lillian. I know about my father. I know that I am not your daughter. The color drained from the woman's face. The shears fell from her hand, clattering on the wooden porch. For a moment, her carefully constructed mask of bitter resolve crumbled, revealing a flash of raw, cornered panic. She looked at Alistair, who stood a few feet behind Elara, his face grim and implacable, and she knew the game was over. He told you, she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. That man, he was always watching. He was protecting me, Elara corrected. From you. The woman let out a harsh, joyless laugh. Protecting you? I gave you a home. I gave you a life. You were a constant, daily reminder of my husband's betrayal. Every time he looked at you, I saw the love he had for her. Did you expect me to cherish that? To coddle the living proof of my own inadequacy? The confession, so raw and filled with spite, was a final brutal confirmation of what Elara now knew to be true. She had never been seen as a child, only as a symbol. The pain of it was immense, but it was also a clean break, a final cauterizing wound. The debt was a lie, wasn't it? Elara pressed, needing to hear her admit to every layer of the deception. You were willing to sell me for a problem that didn't even exist. That farm was all I had left of him, the woman shrieked, her voice cracking with a hysteria that was 20 years in the making. And it was failing. I did what I had to do to survive. You were my only asset. The word asset struck Elara with the force of a physical blow. It was the final nail in the coffin of their twisted relationship. There was nothing left to salvage, nothing to mourn. There was only the truth, ugly and liberating. Elara felt a strange, cold pity for this woman. A person so consumed by bitterness that she had sacrificed her own humanity. Elara turned to leave, her back straight, her head held high. She had her answers. She was free. But as she reached the bottom of the porch steps, the woman's voice, now dripping with a final desperate venom, called out to her. "You think you know everything now, don't you? You think he's your savior?" She sneered, her eyes glittering with malice. "Your precious mother Lillian didn't just leave you in my husband's care. She left you a trust fund. A substantial one. Meant for you on your 21st birthday." Elara stopped, her body rigid. "For 20 years I've been taking from it," the woman confessed, a cruel, triumphant smile twisting her lips. "Just a little at a time. For the farm. For expenses. For me. What little is left is locked away in a bank account. And the account isn't in your name. It's in the name of the child I was supposed to have, the one I lost. A name you've never even heard." The final confession, delivered with such spiteful glee, was meant to be a parting shot, a final poisoned arrow to cripple Elara as she walked away. And it did hurt. The knowledge that a lifeline, a legacy from her true mother, had been within her reach all along, only to be secretly plundered by the woman she'd been forced to trust, was a profound and sickening betrayal. It was the theft not just of money, but of security, of a mother's final loving provision for her child. Yet, as the car pulled away from the farmhouse, leaving the bitter woman standing alone on the porch, Elara felt something other than just pain. It was a strange, clean sense of finality. The last tie had been severed. Every lie had been exposed, every twisted root pulled from the soil. There was nothing left to hold her to that place, to that woman, ever again. She looked at Alistair, his hand steady on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He had said nothing during the confrontation, allowing Elara the space to claim her own truth. His silent, solid presence had been an anchor in the storm. "She won't get away with it," he said, his voice low and firm, anticipating her thoughts. "My lawyers are the best. We will find the account. We will recover what we can. She will be held accountable for the fraud." Elara nodded, a sense of weary gratitude washing over her. But the fight for the money felt secondary, a distant echo of the real battle that had just been won. The true victory was the severing of the emotional chains that had bound her for 20 years. For the first time, she felt a sense of profound, terrifying, and exhilarating freedom. She was adrift, but she was no longer tethered to a lie. In the weeks that followed, Alistair was true to his word. A team of discreet, ruthlessly efficient lawyers descended upon the fraudulent trust. The process was swift and clinical. The hidden bank account was found, the remaining funds frozen and transferred to a new, secure account in Elara's name. It was less than a quarter of what Lillian had originally left, but it was still a considerable sum, more money than Elara had ever imagined possessing. It was a start, a foundation. She made the difficult but necessary choice to cut all ties. She did not press for legal charges that would result in prison time for the woman who had raised her. The idea of a public spectacle felt cheap, a continuation of the drama. Instead, she had the lawyers draw up an agreement. The woman would be allowed to live out her days on the farm, but the property itself, which Alistair's legal maneuverings had placed under his control, would one day revert to its rightful owner. To Elara, it was a clean surgical cut. An ending. Elara never returned to the farmhouse. Alistair arranged for a few of her personal belongings, books, a handful of photographs of her father, a small box of keepsakes, to be collected. Everything else she left behind. It was part of a life that was no longer hers. She remained at the Blackwood estate, a guest in a house that was technically, through the bizarre sham of her marriage, her own. The vast, silent mansion began to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Alistair gave her space, treating her with a gentle paternal respect that was entirely new to her. He was not a replacement for the father she had lost, but he was a bridge to the parents she had never known. He would share small stories of Lillian, of her kindness, her love for art, her quiet strength. He spoke of her father, Thomas, with a surprising lack of resentment, acknowledging the profound and undeniable connection he had shared with Lillian. Through his stories, Alara began to piece together the mosaic of her heritage. But she felt aimless, a ship without a rudder. The money sat in the bank, a testament to a past she was still struggling to understand. What was she supposed to do now? The only life she had ever known, the life of a flower farmer's daughter, was tainted, the soil poisoned by lies. One cool afternoon, as she was wandering the immaculate, colorless gardens of the estate, Alistair found her. He was holding a small leather-bound book. "I thought you might like to see this," he said gently. It was Lillian's. He led her away from the perfectly manicured lawns, down a winding stone path half hidden by overgrown ivy. They came to a tall iron gate, rusted and choked with weeds. Alistair produced an old, ornate key and, with a groan of protest from the hinges, pushed the gate open. Beyond it lay a different world. It was a garden, but unlike the rest of the estate, this one had been left to run wild for years. It was a chaotic tangle of climbing roses, their thorny branches reaching for the sky like desperate arms. Weeds choked ancient flower beds. A stone birdbath was green with moss, and a crumbling stone bench was almost completely hidden by a cascade of untamed wisteria. In the center of it all stood a magnificent, dilapidated glasshouse, its panes cloudy with grime and cracked in several places. It was a scene of beautiful decay, a secret forgotten place. "This was Lillian's private garden," Alistair said, his voice soft with memory. "Her sanctuary. She designed it herself. It was filled with rare and unusual roses, plants she collected from all over the world. After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to change it, so I locked the gate. It has been like this for 20 years. Alara stepped inside, her feet sinking into the soft, untamed grass. It was a mess, but even in its neglect, she could see the ghost of its former glory. She could feel the love that had gone into its creation. It had a soul, something the rest of the estate's pristine grounds completely lacked. She ran her fingers over the velvety petal of a single, deep crimson rose that had managed to bloom amidst the chaos. Felt like coming home. She kept journals, Alistair said, holding out the leather-bound book. She documented everything. Every plant, every bloom, every success and failure. Alara took the journal. The leather was soft and worn. She opened it to a random page. Lillian's handwriting was elegant and precise, a beautiful flowing script. It was a record of her passion, filled with detailed notes on soil acidity, pruning techniques, and poetic descriptions of the colors and scents of her beloved flowers. It was a conversation across time. That night, Alara sat by the fire in her room, the same fireplace that had once hidden the truth, and read Lillian's journal from cover to cover. She read about the midnight blue rose that Lillian had struggled for years to cultivate, and the angel's kiss climbing rose with its delicate, pale pink blossoms. She read of Lillian's frustrations with aphids, her joy at a successful graft, her profound, almost spiritual connection to the earth. It was her father's passion, but with a different voice, a different touch. In her mother's words, Alara felt an intense, overwhelming connection. This was her blood. This was her legacy. A new purpose began to bloom within her, as quiet and certain as a seedling pushing through the soil. The next morning, she found Alistair in his study. "I know what I want to do with the inheritance," she announced, her voice clear and confident. "I want to restore her garden." Alistair looked up from his paperwork, a slow, gentle smile spreading across his face. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile. I think Lillian would have liked that very much. She poured her heart, her energy, and her inheritance into the project. She hired a small team of gardeners to help with the heavy clearing, but the delicate work, the pruning, the planting, the nurturing, that she did herself. Her days were spent with her hands in the soil, mud on her cheeks, and a sense of fulfillment she had never known. She used Lillian's journals as her guide, a map to recreating the lost sanctuary. She painstakingly identified the surviving, overgrown rose bushes, clearing away the weeds that had threatened to suffocate them. She repaired the crumbling glass house pane by pane, transforming it into a warm, humid haven for delicate seedlings. The garden began to breathe again. Color returned to the forgotten corner of the estate. The deep crimsons, pale pinks, and sunny yellows of the resurrected roses bloomed in defiant beauty. The scent of living things replaced the musty smell of decay. Tending her mother's garden became a form of therapy, a way of tending to the wounded parts of her own soul. Each new bud was a victory, each bloom a promise of renewal. She was no longer just a farmer's daughter or a secret child. She was a creator, a restorer, a woman building a future on a foundation of love she had inherited through blood and soil. One evening, months into the restoration, she was sitting in the now gleaming glass house, paging through another of Lillian's journals, this one focused on hybridizing techniques. Her fingers traced her mother's notes, a familiar and comforting ritual. As she turned a page describing the specific cross-pollination that had resulted in the Alara dawn rose, a stunning revelation that her father had not named it for her, but that Lillian had created it in his honor and he had then named it for their daughter, she felt a small lump in the binding. Tucked deep between the pages, almost completely hidden, was a small folded piece of thick, official-looking paper. It was not a note or a pressed flower. Her brow furrowed in confusion. Carefully she worked it free. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. It was a property deed. The document was old, the ink faded but still legible. Her eyes scanned the legal description, the official seals, the signatures. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she read the name of the property owner, Lillian Blackwood, and the address of the property listed below. It was unmistakable. It was the address of her family's flower farm. Lillian had secretly bought the farm years ago, leaving it in Thomas's care, a silent gift to the man she loved. The farm had never belonged to her father's wife. It had never been hers to sell, to leverage, to use as a bargaining chip. All along, through a legacy of love she never knew existed, the farm had been rightfully hers. The discovery of the deed was the final, resounding note in a symphony of secrets. It was not a weapon of anger or revenge, but a quiet, irrefutable statement of truth. The farm, the place of her birth and the stage for her fabricated childhood, had been a gift of love from one parent to the other, a silent promise to provide for a future they could never share. The woman who had raised Alara had been not just a cruel guardian, but a squatter on hallowed ground, her bitterness a weed in a garden she had no right to tend. Armed with this ultimate truth, the legal proceedings were a mere formality. Alistair's lawyers presented the deed, and the matter was settled with quiet, decisive finality. Alara was now the undisputed owner of her father's farm and the sole beneficiary of Lillian's legacy, the two properties spiritually and legally bound together, just as their namesakes had been. She did not evict the woman who had raised her. In a final act of grace that was entirely her own, she allowed her to live in the small farmhouse, a tenant on the land she once controlled. It was a merciful, quiet end to a painful chapter, a demonstration that Alara's heart had not been hardened by the deceit she had endured. The story then leaps forward 1 year, to a sun-drenched afternoon in late September. The air, which had once carried the funereal scent of wilting wedding roses, was now alive with the vibrant, joyful perfume of 1,000 living blossoms. The iron gate to Lillian's forgotten garden stood wide open, no longer a barrier but an invitation. Inside, the transformation was breathtaking. The garden was a masterpiece of controlled wildness, a riot of color and life. The once choked rosebushes now climbed trellises in elegant cascades of crimson, ivory, and blush. The flower beds overflowed with perennials and wildflowers, buzzing with the happy industry of bees. The glass house, once dilapidated, now gleamed in the sun, its warm, humid interior a nursery for the next generation of beauty. The forgotten sanctuary had been reborn, and it was the heart of Alara's new life. She had merged the two properties into a single thriving business she called the Blackwood Bloom. The farm, with its sturdy greenhouses and open fields, was the commercial engine, producing flowers for markets and florists across the region. Lillian's garden was the soul, a stunning botanical showcase and the source of her most prized and unique hybrids. The once gothic, intimidating Blackwood estate was no longer a place of shadows. It was now famous for its beauty, a destination for garden lovers and a popular venue for small, elegant weddings, real weddings, filled with the joy and hope hers had so painfully lacked. Alara herself was transformed. The timid, haunted girl in the second-hand dress was gone. In her place stood a confident young woman, her hands often smudged with dirt, her face glowing with purpose. She moved with an easy grace through the gardens, her knowledge of each plant intimate and profound. She had not just restored her mother's garden. She had made it her own, adding new varieties, creating her own hybrids, and pouring her own spirit into the soil. She had found that the language of flowers was her native tongue. Her relationship with Alistair had settled into a comfortable, deeply affectionate bond that defied easy definition. He was not her father, but he was her family. He was her mentor, her fiercest protector, and her most ardent supporter. The sham marriage had been quietly annulled, the legal pretense no longer necessary, but their connection had only deepened. He had found in his twilight years the daughter he had never had, a living legacy of the woman he had loved in his own quiet, stoic way. The great, lonely mansion was no longer silent. It was a home, often filled with the scent of fresh-cut flowers Alara brought inside, their vibrant colors a stark, beautiful contrast to the dark wood and old stone. Laughter echoed in the halls that had once held only secrets. One morning, Alara took a simple bouquet of pale yellow Alara dawn roses and deep crimson Thomas's heart blooms, a variety she had cultivated and named herself, and drove to the small country churchyard. She placed half of the bouquet on her father's grave, the familiar stone a comforting, solid presence. She traced the letters of his name, a quiet thank you for his love, however complicated it had been. Then she walked to a different section of the cemetery, to a graceful marble headstone that read Lillian Blackwood. She had never been here before. She knelt and placed the rest of the flowers at its base, the two colors mingling in perfect harmony. She felt no sorrow, only a profound sense of peace, of a circle finally being closed. She was the daughter of both, a product of their impossible love, and she was at last whole. The story culminates on the first anniversary of the Blackwood Bloom's official opening. Alara was hosting a small garden party, a celebration of the season's harvest and her own hard-won success. The garden was filled with people from the local community, clients, suppliers, friends she had made over the past year. Sunlight streamed through the leaves, dappling the stone paths where guests mingled, glasses of lemonade in hand. Alara stood near the restored birdbath, greeting her guests, her smile easy and genuine. She wore a simple sundress, the color of a summer sky, and her hair was tied back with a velvet ribbon. She looked happy. She looked free. From a stone bench under the shade of an ancient oak tree, Alistair watched her. The stern lines of his face had softened over the past year, erased by a contentment he had never expected to find. He saw Lillian's grace in the way Alara moved, and he saw Thomas's resilience in the determined set of her jaw. He saw a young woman who had taken a legacy of pain, deceit, and heartbreak, and had cultivated it into something beautiful and life-affirming. His promise had been fulfilled. His duty was done. Tears of pure, unadulterated pride welled in his eyes, and he did not bother to wipe them away. Ilara caught his eye from across the lawn and gave him a radiant smile. In that shared glance, a world of understanding passed between them, gratitude, affection, and the quiet, unbreakable bond of a family forged not by convention, but by love's enduring, unconventional power. She turned her gaze back to the garden, her garden. It was more than just a collection of plants. It was a living testament to her story. Its roots were nourished by a secret, tragic love. Its soil was turned by the pain of lies and betrayal. But from that difficult ground, she had grown a life of strength, beauty, and purpose. The wedding night with her father's age-old groom had not been an ending. It had been the cracking of a seed in the darkest of earth, a painful, unconventional, and ultimately glorious beginning. She had found her roots, and in doing so she had finally magnificently bloomed.